Okay. Welcome everyone to Linking Local, National, and International Struggles with Ajamu Baraka, the national organizer for the Black Alliance for Peace, a people-centered human rights project against war, repression, and imperialism, and Dr. Akinyele Umoja. My name is Omi, and I will be the facilitator for this event. And I will first read an introduction for Ajamu and Dr. Umoja, and then we'll hand it over to both our guests to get started. Ajamu Baraka is a human rights defender whose experience spans 4 decades of domestic and international education and activism. He is a veteran grassroots organizer whose roots are in the Black liberation movement and anti-apartheid and Central American solidarity struggles. He is currently an editor and contributing columnist for the Black Agenda Report and the national organizer for the Black Alliance for Peace. Dr. Akinyele Umoja is an American educator and author who specializes.
I'm a New African educator.
New African educator.
That's not what they call it, Wikipedia.
New African educator and author who specializes in African American studies. As an activist, he is a founding member of the New African Peoples Organization and the Malcolm X grassroots movement. In April 2013, New York University Press published Umoja's book, We Will Shoot Back, on resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement. And I will hand it over to both our guests.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. And, in behalf of Sankofa Society, which I'm the advisor for and is sponsoring this conversation, and our brother Kamari is one of our leaders, along with Adama. So I want to salute them for having an initiative to put this together. But I'm really honored to have Ajamu Baraka come to our campus, even though we're at the Auburn Avenue Research Library, but they're our community partner. I met Ajamu when I moved to Atlanta in 1984. During that time, he was a student activist at Atlanta University. And truth be told, he's one of the people who actually, I wasn't in school. I hadn't even finished my bachelor's, and he's one of the people who encouraged me to finish my education so I could educate. And so he taught me, he and a brother named Camus, whose last name? Jennings, Keith Jennings, who was, they both kind of pioneered in Atlanta doing work around human rights in the spirit of Malcolm X, but kind of from a more revolutionary perspective, I could say that. A lot of people were approaching human rights from a more liberal perspective. And so Ajamu, really from a revolutionary and Pan-African perspective, initiated the human rights organizing and education. So I just want to move from there. Ajamu, now you're originally from Florida. Tell me where you're originally from.
Well, first, I would like to thank the students for pulling this together. It's another opportunity to have a much needed conversation. For some of us, it's a continuation of a program we had last night. So they might hear a few things that they heard last night, but these kinds of conversations are so vitally important, especially at this moment in history, when we are facing the kind of challenges we are facing today. And of course, my brother Akinyele, who's been a long-time freedom fighter. And we were just talking a minute ago about how long it's been and the lessons we've learned and the struggles we're going to have to continue to engage in. I'm so happy to see he's in a position to be able to bring that experience and bring that information and cutting-edge analysis to generation after generation of young African students. So I want to salute you, my brother, for your outstanding work. No, I lived in Florida. I grew up on the south side of Chicago.
I didn't know that.
Yes, before I went south. Well, it was a long history from there. I ended up in the U.S. military in 1972. Yes, and that's basically when I started making the transition from, the streets had me for a couple of years, but I got scared straight, if you will, and ended up in the military, and that's when I really was able to take on the label and take on the responsibility that Chairman Fred had thrown down to us when he said, we told people, I am a revolutionary. Right. At that point, I couldn't say that because I wasn't ready to make that kind of commitment. But by 1972, in the U.S. military and ending up in Germany as part of the U.S. occupation forces, I was able to say at that point, I am a revolutionary, and that's been my identity ever since.
So you're in the U.S. military during the Vietnam War era.
Right.
How was that a space that you were able to transform from, you said you was in the street, that you were able to transform into being a revolutionary where you could hear Chairman Fred Hampton by that point?
Well, Akinyele, you remember that there were certain spaces that young Africans went into that allowed them to sort of become re-socialized. The prison and the military. Now, people also did some of that in academia, but in terms of the real turn toward militarism, militancy, it was those two institutions. So when we went in 1972, it was so many brothers at that point who had made that leap. And part of helping us to grow up was to introduce us to these deeper frameworks, a broader understanding of who we were and who we could be. So that provided the foundation for my eventual transformation. So we made the leap, and a year after I ended up in Germany, we were leading struggles against the U.S. military when we discovered that the U.S. military, through NATO, was actually training Portuguese pilots to wage war in Africa, in the Portuguese colonies of Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique. So, we're going to talk about NATO, but that was the beginning of my understanding of how nefarious that white supremacist institution was, beginning in 1973 or so.
Wow, so that's a trip to me because so much of the work of the Black Alliance Against Peace, the first thing I noticed was the challenge around y'all challenging Africana. It might have been something before that, but that's the first thing that comes to my consciousness. And so for you, this goes back decades of your awareness of the role that they were playing on the African continent to suppress. Talk just a little bit, because one of the things I find is things that, when say like you and I were in our 20s, like the struggles that were going on the African kind of liberation movement, what impact they might have had on you and other folks in your generation during that particular period of time.
Well, it was centered. Part of the political transformation was developing a deeper understanding of the liberation movements and the connection between what we understood and had experienced growing up in the settler colony of the U.S., understanding those connections. So part of taking on the responsibility of being a revolutionary was to make sure, it was to ground ourselves in a deeper understanding of those connections. So it was centered. We studied everything we get our hands on. Because it's one thing to be a revolutionary in the general public, it's something else to attempt to do that while you're in the U.S. military. So, we got our hands on everything we could, and we studied. We followed the events taking place back in the U.S. as we followed the events taking place on the African continent. And we saw ourselves as in a sort of preparatory process for when we knew we were going to re-enter back into the U.S. But in the meantime, we also saw ourselves as having the responsibility to engage in certain kinds of activities, including providing political education to other Africans who were in the U.S. military. So we opposed had strikes against the military when we found out about the role they were playing with NATO. In 1973, when Egypt went across the Sinai Desert and surprised the Israelis and almost defeated Israel, they put military forces in Germany on alert to go to the aid of Israel. And so we were quite clear that we were not going to allow ourselves to be deployed to Israel. And we took that position. And so, we had to help people to understand why it was important to take that kind of position. So we grounded ourselves in the movements on the continent, but also in the anti-colonial struggles taking place across the world. And remember now, this is the long 1960s was still in place, even though it was early 1970s. Mm-hmm. So the idea of the possibility of a revolutionary victory was still there. I say sometimes that, unfortunately, some young people who had never had a chance to experience, they really missed out on the kind of attitude that we had, the position that we had. We absolutely knew that we could win. There was no question in our minds about that, And when you know you can win, it's something that stays with you forever, okay? So by 1973, we knew that we can win. But we also understood the kind of sacrifices it was necessary to make in order to win. So these are all the kinds of connections we were making as we was in the military, preparing ourselves, engaging in various kinds of activities to contribute to the resistance. Stuff that we don't even talk about today.
What I was going to say, that's something I hope we come back to, because being in the same generation, that's one of the biggest things I see in contemporary movements as opposed to, like you said, the 70s. I mean, we envision that revolutionary forces were going to take state power.
Exactly.
We had a variety of visions of what that looked like.
Right.
But that was the strategy. That was the hope. But I don't get a sense of the demands today, and the possibilities are a lot more significantly limited. So I hope that's something that is asked further on. Now, so when you left the military, and where'd you go from there?
Well, once I left the military, I ended up in the Bahamas for a little while with my first wife, and then I ended up in Florida in 1978. And my entry point to really being grounded in the domestic struggle was as a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party in 1978. And from there, I wanted to go to the real South. And that's why I ended up in Atlanta at Clark Atlanta University in 1982.
So before you go, we talk about the AU Center and that whole period. We got somebody else who was an AU Center activist walked in. But talk about the All African People's Revolutionary Party and what it was like in the 70s. Just a little bit about it, because again, my memory of it is not what I kind of what I see today, and so I just want students to know what that was like during that period of time.
Well, you know, it was important to be in an organization, and I went into the AAPRP because of its internationalist standing. At that time, the party was committed to organizing students and workers. In fact, there was a formula that we had in terms of the amount of concentration. It was something like 40% workers, 60% students. And so that for me was very important, because I already had that internationalist perspective, understanding those connections, and the commitment to revolutionary Pan-Africanism. So it was a good entry point. And one of the things that was really important about that experience was the commitment to study, which was very, very important. The party today is somewhat different in the sense that one of the things that we emphasized back in those days was we weren't going to get what it was perceived to be bogged down in immediate interest, in immediate issues. Mm-hmm. It was all about preparing our forces. And we saw, you know, all the various issues that capitalism was developing as somewhat of a diversion. And we sort of stayed aloof of that. Well, that made it very difficult for some of us who felt like the only way we can build not only the party, but an effective revolutionary movement is that you had to also be involved in the issues that were impacting the masses of our people, be it police killings, contradictions around housing or whatever. So it almost meant that we had to have a double job as activists or revolutionaries. And it weighed on us. Today, the party doesn't have that issue. Party activists are involved in all kinds of activities, but they also have maintained the view that it is all strategically located or connected to the end objective, which is the seizure of power and the construction of a socialist project, both in the national territory that they find themselves, but also internationally. As Kwame Nkrumah said, the revolutionary Pan-Africanist movement is part of the worldwide movement, worldwide revolutionary process, the worldwide process toward socialist transformation. So the party today is I think, is one of the groups, one of the formations in the forefront of helping our people to move forward in that way.
That's right. Now, so you come to Atlanta, and you know, I kind of want to move us forward a little bit. I mentioned in my early comments that you, and to some degree, Camus, I remember you all beginning to talk about human rights in a particular type of way. And you, what moved you to talk about human rights in the way you all talked about it, and what did that lead you to do in terms of your organizing?
Well, we began to excavate the African radical human rights tradition, looking at the cutting edge work of W.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, and Shirley Graham Du Bois, Claudia Jones, in that period right after the Second Imperialist War, between 1945 and 1951, and how they define human rights. Their definition of human rights was that it went beyond the liberal focus on individuals and abstract rights. They saw it as a framework that came out of struggle, a framework that had an anti-capitalist and, even more importantly, an anti-colonial perspective. And so we saw that the hegemony of liberal human rights had a counter, and that counter had emanated from our own struggles. So we looked at what they did, but then we also understood that the real sort of transformative personality was Malcolm. Well, Malcolm, made it absolutely clear. And remember now, Malcolm was also influenced by that activity during that period. The petitions that were made to the United Nations between 1946 and 1951, culminating in the 1951 recharged genocide by the Civil Rights Congress. So when Malcolm was making his calls in 1964 for a to redefine the struggles in the U.S., moving it from an understanding of a struggle for civil rights to a struggle for human rights, that was informed by his understanding of the potential of that framework for redefining and reframing our struggle, for helping us to go from a national perspective to an international one. So that informed how we began to look at this framework. And I went a little bit further and helped to develop it some more, and we call it today the people-centered human rights framework. And that is one of the principal components of the work of the Black Alliance for Peace, that we center this ideal of the transformative character of human rights centered in the needs of the people, committed to principles like self-determination, self-organization, and the idea that for us to be able to realize human rights, we've got to transform social conditions and social relationships. In other words, it has to be part of a revolutionary program. That's much different than these liberals who will suggest that human rights is something that's only connected to the individual, that they can be realized within the existing system. We reject that because we say that the existing settler colonial project is completely counter to our needs, our aspirations, and our experiences.
There's some terminology. I guess the educator in me wants you to expound on a couple of things. One is you mentioned a second imperialist war.
Right.
And I think most of us have been educated, it's called something else. And so I want you to talk about that. And what do you mean by a settler colonial project?
Well, we all know that there were, in the 20th century, there was the two wars, so-called World War I and World War II. But both of these wars were connected. It was part of the redivision that was taking place in the 20th century among the European powers and empires. And there was just the first war that started in 1914 had a brief pause for a few years in the 1920s. But the contradictions, the competition between these colonialist Western European powers weren't resolved. And so it continued. And then you had the capitalist crisis in the 1930s. And the response to the capitalist crisis in Europe was the creation of what we refer to as European fascism. And that became the framework of competition and struggle in Europe. Now we say, we make a distinction between European fascism and what we understand to be fascism. Because, for Europeans, the fascists and people like Hitler are the personification of evil. And they play that role because Du Bois and Aimé Césaire from Senegal said that basically what happened with Mussolini, but primarily with Hitler, was that the practices that were the norm in the colonial world, the terror, the absence of democracy, the state violence, the brutality, that characterized the relationships between the colonized and the colonial powers. Those relationships were transferred from the colonies to Europe by the fascist movement. And now all of a sudden they are the embodiment of evil, okay? So we make that distinction that those of us who have been colonized, we understand what fascism is, okay? And it didn't have a word before the 1920s, but you know, that's what it was. So, you know, we talk about these struggles between 1914. They were finally resolved by 1945 at the end of the Second Imperialist War. And they were not resolved, but they came to a certain sort of temporary stability, if you will. And that is when the world was basically divided between the victorious powers coming out of the Second World War, the Soviet Union, that it was in alignment or were allies with the United States and the lesser, at that point, European powers, and they divided the world between the Soviet Union and the U.S., basically, okay? The U.S. emerged as the most powerful empire really the planet has ever seen, beginning in 1945. So we see both of those conflicts as imperialist conflicts, both interconnected. And so we don't always refer to it as the Second World War, but the Second Imperialist War.
In settler colonialism, you mentioned settler colonial a couple of times.
Yeah. We all understand that the creation of this thing we call the United States of America was as a consequence of the colonization by Great Britain, the UK, the United Kingdom, and their expansion across the globe. They were one of the European powers that were expanding, primarily beginning in the Americas. Let me back up for a second. It's important for us to restate, and we need to say this all the time when we are engaged with our people and engaged with everybody else who's trying to understand the world. What we know today as Western Europe is a consequence of a process. That process of the European powers becoming dominant started when the Europeans spilled out of Europe in 1492. That it was the expansion of the Spanish and then the Portuguese and other powers in the Americas, and the conquering of the indigenous, the seizure of indigenous land, and the importation of Africans, providing basically free labor that created the material basis for the ascendancy of Europe, for the creation of what they refer to as Western civilization. Okay? That process of European colonization included, of course, the United States of America. People forget that, you know, this notion of the U.S. being some kind of perennial, natural nation state is a myth. That these Europeans came, they started to colonize along the eastern coast as part of the British Empire. After a few decades or so, or a century, their offspring, the new quote-unquote American bourgeoisie, felt constrained by the UK, constrained by their subservient position vis-a-vis the masters back in London, and they rebelled. And they rebelled because they wanted to do two things. They wanted to expand to the west, and they wanted to expand the slave trade, both of which the UK was opposed to, Great Britain was opposed to, not because of some kind of commitment to some kind of superior morality, but because they saw it as costly. They, in fact, were trying to move more toward a process of free labor, as being more efficient than the slave process. And so they put constraints on their offspring. And that's when they launched their glorious American Revolution. But these are colonists. And what you have is the most vicious kind of colony, where you have settlers who will come into a territory to displace the indigenous people. Because they're the ones who then will end up fighting the hardest to maintain their position. We saw it in South Africa, in what became Zimbabwe, in Kenya. These folks, you know, they fight the hardest to maintain the colonial project. Israel. So we say that this settler colony that was established in 1609 continues. Even though you had it formalized into this American government basically in beginning 1789 after the so-called Revolutionary War, and then consolidated really in 1791, is a continuation of the same process. So we have to remind people that the U.S. is a settler colony. And that these individuals who call themselves so-called Americans are settlers. They are occupiers, okay? And by extension, until or unless we have a anti-colonial revolutionary perspective, we become occupiers, okay? So we have to make that distinction, that separation between ourselves as a colonized people and this settler colonial project. So we always refer to these individuals, the system, as a settler colonial project, and the U.S. as a settler colonial state.
This is right on point. I want to ask one more question. I haven't really had a lot of conversations. We point to different moments when we've seen each other in the last few years. I think Sankofa posted a photo of us together after the electoral victory. I think it was Chokwe Antar Lumumba. I can't remember which one it was. But so I could go on and ask some questions, but I do want to, I understand some of the students had questions too, so I want to ask one more before I take theirs. And I know there were some things that you wanted to entertain in terms of currently what Black Alliance for Peace positions and initiatives Black Alliance for Peace has. But if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but the perspective of Black Alliance for Peace is one of the perspectives is Black internationalism. So why is it Black internationalism rather than just internationalism? I know that historically there have been people who call themselves internationalists, either proletarian internationalists or whatever. So why is it Black internationalism?
Well, primarily just because that is a term that is still in usage. It's something that the masses of the people understand and still use. We could very easily say African internationalism, or African American, if you will. But we refer to it, we'll say Black/African, only because as organizers we understand that we have to deal with consciousness where it's at in order to take it forward. But the operative term there is internationalism. That basically, as we've been talking about, we can't hope to develop an effective revolutionary process unless we understand what it is we up against. What are the forces that are shaping our realities? And we say that you can't understand your own national reality unless you contextualize it. And when you contextualize it, you understand that this is part of a global system. There's no such thing as liberation of African people in the U.S. Being separate from the liberation of African people and other colonized people globally. because it's one system. We talked about the U.S. settler state. We talked about the fact that the U.S. has emerged as the most powerful empire that we've ever seen. Well, the empire, the global U.S. empire, is just an expansion of the U.S. settler colonial state. It's the same system. Okay, it's part of the global colonial capitalist system. You know, people refer to things like racial capitalism. What is that? That's no more than colonial capitalism, all right? It was the colonial capitalist mode of production that provided the framework, again, for the emergence of Europe. It is those relationships that they are now fighting desperately to maintain globally, because they understand that it is that relationship that provides the material basis for their continued dominance. If you change that relationship, if you change that predatory relationship between the U.S. and Western Europe and the global South, that basically, you know, what we know of as Western Europe and the U.S. can no longer exist in the same way. And they understand that. And that's why they are fighting the way they are right now, and prepared to, in fact, blow up the entire world in order to maintain white supremacy. And when we talk about white supremacy also, too, we make a distinction. We're not concerned about what is in people's heads. We don't give a damn what white people think about us, okay? We point to the material basis of white supremacy, okay? We also make a distinction between white supremacy and white supremacist ideology. I mean, they're connected, of course, but it's white supremacist ideology that helps to undergird the structures of white supremacy. And we say that one can be a white supremacist regardless of the definition of your race that may be imposed on you. That ain't about just white folks being white supremacists. Some of the most virulent white supremacists I know are African people, some of them, okay? So, I mean, Barack Obama was one of the most vicious white supremacists that we've ever had a chance to be exposed to, if you will, okay? So, you know, that's an ideological perspective we have to kind of deal with. So, you know, we look at these things as structural relationships, and that's why that international perspective is absolutely critical. Because if not, you'll find yourself struggling against ghosts, pretending you can be so-called liberated, but what you're really pushing for in the U.S. is nothing but reformism. And we've got to clear up that kind of confusion.
You have to follow that up. Barack Obama is one of the
Most vicious
white supremacists. Break that down. What, you know, what's the basis of that statement? So we're very clear.
Well, you know, it goes even beyond when I got in trouble when I was running in 2016 on the ticket with Jill Stein, because I had mentioned a few months before that that Barack Obama was a Uncle Tom, and so they wanted me to renounce. They wanted me to renounce myself.
Who's that?
Oh, white folks.
Okay.
I don't know. Some of y'all may not have paid attention. Everybody did. And in fact, Lucado remembers when we did the town hall on CNN, Chris Como raised it again on national television.
I did see that.
Yeah. Yeah, wanted me to renounce myself again. I say that to say this, that basically it wasn't enough just to say he's an Uncle Tom. We had to go further. That basically Uncle Tom is someone that helps to uphold white power, okay? And his administration was one of the most aggressive administrations in the post-Second Imperialist War period. That his administration, because he was able to project soft power to confuse people, allowed them to, in fact, to apply hard power in the form of coups, subversion, and outright military attacks to uphold and expand white power. So if you look at the number of conflicts that occurred, that continued and deepened, and new conflicts under Barack Obama, you will find that his administration was one of the most aggressive over the last 70 years. So we say that he was a servant of white power. His administration was a vicious administration. They started a war in Yemen. They overthrew the governments in Egypt, in Honduras. They expanded, they re-invaded Iraq. They started the war in Syria. They expanded Africana across the African continent. They attempted to overthrow governments throughout Latin America. They started the continued and deepened the attempts to undermine Venezuela. This was a vicious white supremacist regime, and informed by his ideological commitment to the norm of white dominance. See, people like Barack and these folks, they really believe that the so-called Western civilization represents the apex of human development. They believe it and they aspire to it, you know, to the lifestyle, you know, to how people dress and vacationing in Europe and all the things that they define as the finer things in life. This is what they aspire to be a part of. And they're not the only ones. We got friends and family who also have that kind of colonialist mentality. And they are white supremacists whether they know it or not. But as this struggle intensifies, we're going to see, because they're going to be conflicted, because everybody is going to be required to make a decision on what side you're on. So that's the breakdown with this Uncle Tom Pig, Barack Hussein, we say insane Obama.
And as well as Libya too.
Yes, oh yes.
Yeah, so that's a good word. I just want to check, because I was informed there were some questions that some of you all had, and you just come to the mic and ask your question. So, and I'll recognize you. I just don't want this to be old man dominating the mic the whole time. You know, we ain't supposed to have the mic anyway, right? It's supposed to be a young person rapping. All right, so the sister here, and just tell us who you are.
Hello, I'm Joe. I just want to ask about the role of coalitions in the Black liberation movement and what we can learn from international coalitions.
Can everybody hear her question? Because I don't know if that mic's on. She said, what's the role of coalitions? Hold up, Joe. Role of coalitions in what?
What's the role of Black coalitions in the Black liberation movement, and what can we learn from coalitions in the international scene?
Fantastic question. Well, we've learned a lot from attempting to build coalitions both nationally and internationally. Right now, we have to concentrate, we believe, in consolidating the few coalitions we have here in this country. And we only have a few. You know, those of us who've been around for quite some time, you know, I speak for myself in the sense that I have never seen our people as disorganized as we are today. Okay, and it's very, very dangerous, because the only weapon that we have for survival and for advancing ourselves is the weapon of organization. We can't even exercise our people-centered collective human right to resistance, to self-defense, if we are disorganized. So we have to consolidate ourselves here in the national territory, in this national environment. But we have to simultaneously continue to develop these international coalitions that are developing, because it's all about, I mean, coalition building is about what? It's about concentrating power. It's about, you know, the power of the sum total. You know, you can't, you know, our individual organizations, we're not strong enough to take on this monster and to defeat it. But when you coalesce with other forces, you concentrate your power. So that's what we do on the national and the international level. So it is absolutely vital that we develop more effective coalitions. Because when you talk about developing effective coalitions, you're talking about developing more effective structures, organized structures. And we are doing that. The Black Alliance for Peace, we've only been around for 5 years. And we have been developing our relationships with other organizations, other networks literally around the world, okay? Because again, we understand that we have to concentrate our power. And we're all stronger when we have these kinds of relationships. So it's absolutely vital that we continue that. One of the tasks we're taking on after we get through our membership meeting this weekend is that we're going to be engaged in a more intentional expansion of BAP. We have organizations that have petitioned us to join, who are outside of the U.S. And we have started a process, even though we don't have a protocol for it yet, but you got to sometimes respond to the needs. You can't let, you know, you can't be rigid. And so we kind of, you know, improvising as we go forward. So we have allowed a few groups to join who are engaged in struggle, like places like Haiti, to be a part of BAP, but now we have to develop that in a more formal kind of way. So, you know, we're responding to the objective needs of our peoples. And so that process of developing and expanding BAP, of working with other coalitions here in the country, like the Black is Back Coalition, we are part of the leadership of that coalition. We are part of the National Black Liberation Movement unity process. We see the BAP process as part of that process of building black-left unity, okay? So we're about building that because we're in a fight. In fact, we're in a war. And our responsibility, your responsibilities, are to prepare yourself and to participate in the opposition, but prepare yourself for the objective reality that we are, in fact, in a war, okay? Right now, it's a one-sided war. But, you know, we have to change that relationship, you know. In this war, we're not going to be the only ones who suffer.
Now you mentioned Haiti, and recently I saw a statement that BAP made around the current situation in Haiti. Can you give us the analysis that BAP has of the current situation in Haiti? And you know, what type of direction does the organization propose that we, particularly in the belly of the beast, take toward Haiti?
Well, first we have to recognize the importance of Haiti. You know, we have a team we call the Haiti/Americas team. And we named it that because we see Haiti as key to struggles in the so-called Americas. Some of you all may know that the first permanent settlement of Europeans took place on the island of Santo Domingo, and that spot that we now identify as being part of Haiti. And so symbolically it has that importance, that with the continued lack of self-determination in Haiti, it sort of reflects the lack of self-determination of all African people. So we say Haiti is key for the liberation of African people. We say Haiti is part of the African nation. See, for us, the African nation doesn't just physically exist on the African continent. we say that African people are part of the potential African nation. So what is happening in Haiti today is a crime because the people of Haiti have decided, well, they have always decided, but they have engaged in intense political opposition, calling for the elimination of this puppet government imposed on them by the U.S. And rejecting any notion of outside forces being introduced into Haiti to undermine the will of the people. So they've been in the streets saying, we don't want the U.S., we don't want the European powers, we don't want the UN, because we've already been subjected to 17 years of occupation under the auspices of the United Nations. We want to solve our own problems in our own way. We want you outsiders out, okay? But it's absolutely amazing to us that you would think that our allies among the so-called liberal left would respond in a positive way to what is happening in Haiti and reject the propaganda campaign that we saw that they launched a few weeks ago to provide the justification for reintroducing foreign troops into Haiti, but they haven't. In fact, they have allowed this sort of trope, this of the savage Haitians. When we see Haiti and we see the Africans, you know, on the march, on the move, demanding self-determination, we're proud of that. But some of these European-minded people, they look at these images and they get scared. It is the image of wild and uncontrollable Africans.
Particularly with pro-black folks leading the demonstration.
Exactly. And so they have fallen for the okie doke. And they are providing ideological cover, once again, for Western imperialism. So Haiti for us is key. In fact, you know, we went, some people say, well, we went out on a limb, Brother Akinyele, last week, because the Biden administration, after they had created the ideological framework or the ideological conditions for getting acceptance of the possibility of a force going into Haiti, they then announced that they're going to float a resolution in the UN Security Council. You see, the UN Security Council, legally, theoretically, is the only body that is authorized to introduce military forces into sovereign nations, okay? Well, we called for that resolution to be vetoed in the Security Council. The only powers that have the ability to veto are the 5 permanent members. We knew and we know that the European powers are not going to veto that. So we explicitly called on the Russians and the Chinese to veto the resolution. Now that was pretty bold, some people say, because it's explicitly identifying, if you will, with the enemy of the U.S. But, you know, we define for ourselves as a movement who our friends and who our enemies are.
And that, you know, gets back to black internationalism. You're, from the perspective of our people, you're determining who our friends and enemies, as you said, and what's in our best interest, not necessarily what Biden or
the enemy,
Barack Obama or anybody else. Another question.
Yes, I have another question. It's on. I think it's on now. Yeah, I'm tall. Trying to figure out how to ask this question. So last night, Dr. Ajamu, you were talking about domestic neocolonialism, and I was just, I'm like a new member of BAP, and trying to, like as a local organizer, trying to expand my understanding on what it means to be colonized people locally and nationally, and how that it seems so out of touch even to use the term like internal colony, because I feel like we're at a point socially and politically where a lot of the black masses are identifying more with being American, and we know that's through like, you know, the neocolonial agenda is to assume this, to kind of get us thinking that we're like American. I don't know. I'm also thinking about the rise in like the ADOS movement, and which also just seems like super counterinsurgent to Black internationalism, Black and African internationalism. But last night at last night's panel, you used this term, domestic neocolonialism, and the way you used it and the way you talked about it and defined it last night seemed more relevant to like where we are contemporarily than using the term like internal colony, because even you talking about like America being a settler colony and how I don't think the Black masses understand what that term means, and what it means to be like a colonized people living in the core of an empire. And so my question is like, how do you materialize this idea of domestic neocolonialism? How do we relate that to how do we get the Black masses to see themselves in that light and to see themselves as like a colonized people, even using that term? Yeah, I have another question, but you can answer that one first.
Good question, though.
Very good question. And the way we materialize that, and I like using that term, is to help to make certain material connections. For example, we are involved in the month of action against AFRICOM. AFRICOM is the U.S. Africa Command. It is part of the global command structure by this empire. Those command structures, they have more than 800 bases around the world. This command structure and these bases are there to uphold the power of the empire. We say that these bases and the command structure being effective could not occur without the active collaboration, participation of the local bourgeois forces, the local bourgeois and petty bourgeois forces that control these various states. Well, we then connect that to what's happening in the U.S. We say that in these areas where we have concentrated numbers of African people in the U.S., African people who migrated from the South in the early and mid 20th century and ended up in like 7 to 9 urban areas, that these urban areas are still, are now, as a consequence of our own people's struggle, expanding this bourgeois democracy. It ended up with representatives of the African petty bourgeois and bourgeois class as the neo-colonial leaders, what we refer to as the mixed leadership class. And we can show, and our people understand very clearly the role that these criminals play. They're the ones that, we used to talk about, we got to have community control the police and education and all the institutions. Well, guess what? These Black petty bourgeois elements, they in fact have that. They control the school boards, they control the police forces, they control the social services. They control, to the extent that it exists, the health services, But the plight of the African masses is today worse than it was 50 years ago when they started their ascendancy, okay? So we talk about the fact that the Black masses are suffering, that it's a consequence of this backward colonial capitalist system, and that these native forces, these petty bourgeois forces are the ones that help to perpetuate our suffering. And then we connect that to the fact that this class is playing that same role in Africa, okay? And so we help to make those kinds of political / ideological connections. We talk about the fact that our presence here in this country is a historic one. We all know how we got here. We all know the fact that we were concentrated primarily in the South up until 1910 or so. 90% of African people are in the southern states. Today, a majority of our people are still in the South. Okay, so we talk about those kinds of relationships, that it is colonization of a special kind, if you will. Okay, and because we are colonized people, we also say potentially we are a people, a self-determinate people who have a right to self-determination. We have the right to peoplehood, if you will. We're not just individuals trying to integrate into their system. We have a right to develop ourselves as a people. And that process of developing ourselves into a people is a political process. It's a political project, okay? So we have to make or try to make those kinds of connections, because the objective always is helping to develop a critical consciousness, a critical revolutionary position. Everybody may not accept all aspects of it, and that's all right, okay? But we want people to understand that if you identify with the system and you work on its behalf, whether you understand it or not, you are siding with the enemy of our people, and in fact, the enemy of collective humanity.
I want
Thank
to
you.
kind of add to that. Same perspective. I've been teaching college since '91, and I've always posed that question, the question about who we are and how we should identify ourselves as black folks, to my students. And this is at Morehouse, at Clark, and here at Georgia State. And I remember one experience in 2000, maybe 9. I had somebody come speak to my class from the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa. And the students at that point, they really didn't resonate. And one sister said the greatest day in her life was whatever that day was in November in 2008 when Barack Obama. And so she said she just couldn't identify. She said the speaker, he grew up with Malcolm. That's a different response I'm getting right now, though. After 2020, when the question is posed to students, I think our people know, we colonized. When we were growing up, they used to say we were second-class citizens. But we knew we wasn't really citizens and treated as equals in this country. The masses of people know that. The challenge is on us to really kind of really get with our folks. Malcolm X did that, right? He would make stuff plain where people who was incarcerated in the military, working on garbage trucks, they could really relate to what he was talking about. And so we just have to find that language, and we need to find the form. Sometimes it comes through music and hip hop, so I think that's part of, we have to be able to find the best ways to communicate to our people, because when they're killing us in the street, or when we got to be concerned about these paramilitaries, or when they shut down Atlanta Medical Center, you know what I'm saying? Our people know what the hell's going on.
Yeah, thank y'all for answering that question. I wanted to add that, I guess the point that I was trying to drive home in the question is that I feel like with the rise of ADOS and I just feel like there's a rise among our people to over-identify with being American, and that is through the vehicle of black capitalism and through black misleadership. But my second question was more so about this framework of human rights, which I kind of struggle with personally. And so therefore it's really hard for me to organize around this framework. But when the UN Declaration on Human Rights was written, there was a representative from every part of the world at the table itself for Africa. And I'm just having a hard time I could see it as like a vehicle for liberation, like utilizing this human rights framework. When I think about human rights and like all this discourse of like, are human rights natural? Are they, do they come from people protesting for their rights? Are human rights agreed upon when they're institutionalized? Like, is there a social agreement? Does there have to be a social agreement from those in power for it to be seen as humans? And I'm just even thinking about like recently what happened with BLM, which we know is like counterinsurgent, and BLM even utilizing this framework of human rights, and how like BAP as this revolutionary org is also utilizing that framework, and like what's the difference? I know you talked about that earlier, Dr. Ajamu, but I also see that there's also just this growing disdain against what it means to be human. Like I see that, with even organizers, other lumpins I organize with are just like, like, fuck, I'm a nigga, I'm black, I'm not human, or, things like that. And yeah, and then personally me again, I'm just finding it hard to see how we're utilizing human rights as a framework, and how does that appeal to like also again to the masses. So yeah, that's my last question.
Well, what's the question though? I'm not clear.
Oh, okay.
Are you clear?
I think so.
Okay, I'm not clear.
Yeah, I guess the question is like, yeah, how are we using human rights as a framework differently from like the Black misleadership? And what does it mean to be using human rights as a framework and to not get caught up in like the neoliberal idea of, human rights advocacy and different things like that?
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. The first thing we say is that the framework that we utilize is a framework that is fundamentally different than the liberal framework of human rights. It would be a contradiction for us to use that framework, use those terms in the same way, because we understand their limitations. For the liberal framework of human rights, those rights did emanate from their conception of natural law and natural rights, which was a liberal conception, a conception of rights based on the individual, conception of rights that emanates from states and state agreements, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the covenants and all of the other human rights treaties. It is a state-centric and legalistic concept of human rights. And it is a concept that while they will touch on things like housing and education and all of that from the Declaration, the liberal conception of human rights does not recognize those items as being part of the framework of what human rights are and what states are supposed to be committed to in terms of their realization. For us, we say the people-centered human rights is a framework that emanates from the people. It comes out of struggle. It is those rights, in fact, that are defined and created by the people, that represent a universal commitment to human dignity. And so we don't necessarily identify the specifics. We say that this is a principle, and that the genesis, the source of what the framework is and might be, is still to be determined, because it comes out of the people's struggle. We say that for human dignity, can you have dignity if you don't have a house to live in? If you don't have clothes, if you don't have access to water, if your environment is being polluted by capitalist industries? Shouldn't education be a right, the opportunity to develop one's full human faculties? Shouldn't we all have access to health care? Shouldn't that be a human right? And so we identify these things as the kind of elements that define human dignity. And then we ask the question, well, why can't we realize these things? And then the answer is quite obvious, because we are a colonized people subjected to the logic and the interest of a colonial capitalist system that does not recognize those as dignified items that all of us deserve. In fact, they are prepared to, in fact, fight against us when we talk about these should be at the center of any ideal of human rights. So we depart from that. We talk about collective human rights. We talk about the human right to resistance, the human right to self-determination. And so we make that distinction between liberals and their humanitarian interventions and responsibility to protect, and ourselves to say that fighting against colonialism is a collective human right. Fighting for self-determination is a collective human right. Fighting against all of the structures that exploit and oppress human beings is a responsibility of everyone who believes in the possibility of all of us having so-called human rights. So this is part of the counter narrative, if you will, to the bourgeois conception. You know, because we involved also in an ideological struggle. So we involved in an ideological struggle. So, you know, this is part of the creation of that radical / revolutionary consciousness to redefine for ourselves what these terms and these frameworks mean or might mean for us as we go forward.
Should I just reply to that real quick?
Yes.
So when I think about this Frantz Fanon, what's that Frantz Fanon quote about land, where he's talking about like the importance of land for colonized people? And so I don't know that quote, but it's something about land. Does anyone in the crowd know? Tunde, I think the poster's hanging in your room. Do you know that? I'm just thinking about the lack of relationship, specifically in the black left, the black revolutionary left, to land, and this lack of understanding around like ecology and importance of our relationship to land as like colonized people. And when we talk about this ideological framework of like human, I'm just like, when I think about the etymology of the word human, it's based in hierarchy. Like there's human, and then there's nature, and then there's this, and so I'm just like, in terms of human rights and using this as an ideological framework, I sometimes feel like that takes us away from our relationship to land, because every black revolutionary leftist I meet, it's just very not well versed on like the ecology and land and how, and even just our spiritual relationship to land, if the spiritual is, and I don't feel like the framework of human is allowing us to be able to exist in like our full capacity as like revolutionaries as people who specifically connected to land. Because when I think of even in the terms of indigeneity, that is, when people use that word here in the Americas, it's just like they're only talking about North American indigenous folks and not indigenous folks who are also having their land taken away from them. Like in the Congo, there's like this world's second largest forest that's literally being destroyed, which Congo is like a major, should be a major conversation in environmental sustainability, in ecology, but that's just not happening because I feel like we're so caught up in like the human, and we're just losing our relationship to land. And so going back to this term indigeneity, I see my folks as indigenous to the South. None of my folks migrated during the Great Migrations. They've been here since they were brought here. They've been in Georgia and Alabama. And so I call my folks like indigenous. One, they're indigenous because they were stolen from, West Africa, but they're also indigenous to this land because they were forced to work on it. And so, yeah, I don't know if there's room in human rights as a framework for that to exist. There may be, and I may have to like study more, and this may be like more conversation, but that's just what I'm like struggling with right now. And that's my last thing. Oh, this is the quote. Oh yeah, it says, sorry y'all. It says, for a colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and above all dignity.
I remember that, free land. I wanted to say too, Lakota been on security since 1992. I don't know if nobody else did that. Anyway, and then the sister be next.
Hello, I'm May Kaylia Jackson. I'm a member of Sankofa Society. But my question is, earlier you were talking about how there was like this sense, specifically when you were describing like when you were in the military and like how you became to identify more as a revolutionary during that time, but how like one of the driving forces or something that you still feel today is like this sense back then that there was like, that you had like faith that, you know, we actually could win this. And so my question was, do you think that that's something, like what do you think contributed to that feeling? And then do you think that that's something that could be rebuilt today?
It's a great question.
Good question. First, let me comment briefly on the land question, because I think the land question is in fact critical. And you say you're going to go back and study. I would challenge you to, I would challenge that framework in the sense that the people-centered human rights framework is a developing framework. There is room for all kinds of elements to be part of it. Because again, it emanates from the people and emanates from the people's struggles and understandings. So as we understand our relationship to Mother Earth, we say that, you know, it's not just a human that has rights, but also the rights of Mother Earth as the source of everything that provides us our ability to survive. In Colombia, where I spent a lot of time, there's an intimate relationship or understanding of the relationship between the people and the land, and the concept of territoriality. I would argue that one of the things that has helped to create this sense of our people thinking that there's something called Americans is the result of the migration from the land, and the severance of that relationship between our people who ended up in these death hellhole traps in these urban areas, and the land that they left in the South. We all are old enough to remember that in those first decades of our people being in the South, being in the North, that you know, every summer people were trekking back home, you know, to if they still had land back home, and the grandmother and grandfather was still back home, and even when you messed up, like my brother got sent back down to Mississippi, you know, it was those kinds of connections. I argue that is that severance of that relationship to the land that allowed the enemy to help to develop this sense of our identity being one of so-called Americans. And it is that reconnection that has to be vital. Excuse me. That has to be redeveloped for us to not only understand the cultural significance and the relationship, the spiritual relationship to ourselves and the land, but also to all of the other people around the world who are struggling to maintain that connection to the land. Part of the anti-colonial struggle is, as Fanon said, is about the land. You know, Malcolm said that the base of the revolution was what? About land. So we understand that. So that understanding of that connectionship, of that connection, that understanding of how we should define that, you know, within a human rights framework or whatever, it still has to be developed. So there's no going back to study. It is continuing to think and seeing how that could be worked into a framework of so-called human rights that can resonate with people and make sense for us as we go forward.
I think you should write something on it too.
Definitely. So, but let me.
Yeah, I just want to hear. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, I'm getting old. So.
I can't remember the answer. You talking about you getting old? I can't remember. I want to restate the question because I forgot already.
All good. My question was, earlier you mentioned when you were like in the military and how like your identity as a revolutionary kind of like solidified there, and there was this like sense for you, but like everyone that was involved in the movement, that we actually could win this. And so my question was, what do you think contributed to that sense, and like, do you think that it can be rebuilt today?
Yes. Well, I definitely think it can be rebuilt. I mean, that is the responsibility of those of us who still embrace the term being a revolutionary. You have to have revolutionary optimism. And as Brother Akinyele was saying, there's been a shift, and I'm really impressed with these different generations, but I think it's Generation Z.
I don't know, we're not confused.
Yeah, and people in their 20s, and the lower elements of the millennials who are now in their early 30s, or mid 30s. Okay, there's been a shift, in particular with that Generation Z. I've never seen in many years, many decades, as a matter of fact, the kinds of questions that people are raising nowadays, the kind of identification people are making with attempting to be and embrace revolutionary principles, the kind of theoretical grounding that I see so many people have in various schools of revolutionary thought. There's real intense struggles. And so for me, that kind of development and the objective conditions that don't allow for a reformist corruption leads me to believe that there's going to be a qualitative leap pretty soon in terms of our ability to galvanize a more impactful, more effective revolutionary movement here in this country among our people. So yes, I believe that's going to be revived. We had it in those days because there was so much revolutionary activity, you know? And we know about the more popular kind of expressions with the Panthers and others, but there's a whole lot others out there besides the Panthers, okay? And, because of that spirit of resistance, people forget that back in the 1960s, we're talking about rebellions. We had rebellions, we had the Black months every summer when we burned down some cities, hundreds of rebellions, and even though, we don't, some of us don't advance that as like the be-all of revolutionary activity, it still reflects a certain kind of relationship to the state, to the society, in a kind of spirit. My attitude about Africans in the U.S. was faltering somewhat up until Ferguson.
Yeah.
After I saw Ferguson and saw that spirit, then I saw Baltimore. That helped to revive a lot of stuff for me because I saw the spirit, disorganized, spontaneous, but it was there, okay? And that's why they had to put these petty bourgeois elements on top of that Black Lives Matter thing in order to make sure that spirit, that radical spirit, didn't become the dominant expression, okay? And they had to keep it, focus on some reformist criminal justice stuff. I'm not going to curse, and so-called racial justice and all that. What is that? So but that's not the spirit of the people. The spirit of the people is we want real change. We can envision. We may not know how to get there. We may not be able to articulate exactly what it is we're trying to get to, but it's got to be better than this. Okay, so all of that I feel is coming. I really believe that. Now it's going to be difficult for us in the U.S. because we're at the center of empire, and as these revolutionary processes are successful around the world, all of the social scum in those societies are going to be retreating back to the U.S. Okay, all of the ruling classes that are being displaced, where do they run? They run right back to the U.S. When they collaborate with U.S. imperialism and they get used and they have to run from Afghanistan or wherever, they come to the U.S. Okay, and because they're so-called people of color, if you're confused, you think that these are potential allies, and they're not. Because basically they are representing the class interest and the class perspective and worldview that's alien to our revolutionary process, okay? So because the social scum is coming to the U.S. and will continue to come, the U.S. will be the last outpost of reaction. And these folks are prepared to fight to the end. And you got this radical right developing, the Trumpian right, if you will, that everybody's focused on. And they're the ones taking up oppositional politics more so than the liberal left. they're the ones focused on the so-called elites, because the liberal left has conceded all of this ideological ground to them. But these are neo-fascist forces. But the Democrats are also neo-fascists. We so focus on the Trumpian right, we are not focused on the neoliberal right that's in power, that controls the state. The Trumpian right, they are insurgents because they're outside the state. When their boy was in power for a while, the neoliberal right did everything in its power to make it impossible for them to govern, except in a way that benefited the interests of the neoliberal fascist right. And that's exactly what happened with Trump. They neutered Trump. All of the policies Trump was able to advance were policies in the interest primarily of the neoliberal fascist right. Okay? Now they were concerned with Trump at first, but when they realized, when they saw that they used Russiagate to undermine his ability to be independent, they were cool. In fact, I argue, up until the beginning of 2020, they understood, like all of us understood, Trump was going to be reelected. And that the main objective they had was to do what? Stop Bernie Sanders. That's what they were trying to find, a candidate that could in fact do that. You know, and Biden was like number 4 at first. But then they decided going into, after Super Tuesday, going into South Carolina, that Biden would be the one. And they got Uncle Tom Claiborne out of South Carolina. Claiborne, yeah, and basically they had all the talking points already prepared. It was to stop Bernie Sanders. They knew that, or at that point, they had concluded that Biden couldn't beat Trump. But people have to understand, they don't give a damn about, they don't care about Trump at that point. You know, they were more concerned about a insurgency from the left. And they could live with Trump. It wasn't until the consequences of COVID demonstrated to them by the summertime of 2020 that Trump was vulnerable. And I don't want to go into all the details about that, but basically Trump made some strategic mistakes, and all the money started flowing away from Trump into Biden's camp. And because they said, look, why even take the chance with a Trump in a second term when we can get this dud and put him back in office with these, you know, backward Democrats. And that's exactly what they did. So yeah, we have to deal with the fact that this is going to be the most backward nation on the planet. It's going to become even more dangerous going forward.
Peace and love. How you doing?
Before you go, anybody going to ask you, because I saw you up fire, I'm going to ask questions. Okay. Go ahead, my brother.
My name is Gaddafi Uzumaki. I had some questions on my phone that died, so I don't really remember how to formulate it, but I was wondering what kind of plans does your organization have to utilize it as a tool to gain leverage against this capitalistic institution so that they will adhere or submit to any type of demands that we may have in the future?
Good question. The term, I mean, the messages we've been trying to convey during this conversation and throughout our work is that the only way that we're going to have what you call leverage is when we build power. The only way we build power is through organization. You see, we're not attempting to try to influence the capitalist state. We will, to the extent that we can, in terms of winning certain kinds of concessions, if you will. But we recognize that unless we defeat the capitalist state, we're never going to be able to realize our dignity. We're never going to be able to breathe the air of freedom. So we are about, this organization, this BAP, is about building for power. And we understand that that's a arduous task because we're so disorganized. So we are, our message is build organization, develop power, ground yourself in our people, build local structures of resistance, engage in political educational activity, and we will be on the correct path toward the kind of liberatory politics that we are trying to develop. Does that make sense, brother?
It kind of sounds kind of broad,
Right.
like a lot of the organizations who have come before, to the point that a lot of the conversations we are having today in America, you can see them reflect